A Hells Angels visits his son's grave and finds a Spanish woman crying with her little daughter. Saturday morning, March 15th, dawned cold and damp in San Bernardino, California, the city where the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club was born in 1948. Gray clouds covered the sky like a heavy blanket, threatening to unleash rain at any moment. Mountain View Cemetery, located on the outskirts of the city, was practically deserted at that hour of the morning, with only the occasional sound of birds interrupting the sepulchral silence that reigned among the marble and granite headstones. It was in this place that James Hammer Sullivan, 48 years old, had been coming every Saturday without fail for exactly 3 years. James was an imposing man, standing almost 6.5 feet tall and weighing over 260 pounds, most of it pure muscle gained during decades of physical work as a construction foreman and his countless hours in the gym. His arms were completely covered in tattoos that told the story of his life: a winged skull on his right shoulder, the official emblem of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club, known as the Death Head, prominently tattooed on his back, names of fallen club brothers on his forearms, and on his chest, right over his heart, the name Michael James Sullivan Jr., in elaborate Gothic letters with the date March 12, 2022, underneath. James had been a member of the Hells Angels for over 25 years, having started as a hangaround in his early 20s, working his way through prospect status, and finally earning his full patch at age 25. Over the years, he had built a reputation as one of the most loyal and dependable members of the San Bernardino chapter, serving as sergeant-at-arms for nearly a decade before stepping down 3 years ago after the tragedy that changed his life forever. Michael Jr., or Little Mike as everyone in the club called him, had been James's only child, the product of his marriage to Rebecca Sullivan, a marriage that lasted 12 years before ending in divorce when Michael was 10 years old. Despite the divorce, James and Rebecca had maintained a civil relationship for the sake of their son, and James had been an active father, spending every weekend and many weeknights with Michael. Little Mike had grown up around the club, attending barbecues, toy runs at Christmas where the club delivered presents to underprivileged children, and charity events. He knew all the members by their road names and was treated like a nephew by every single one of them. As Michael grew older, James harbored secret hopes that his son might one day join the club, following in his father's footsteps. But Michael had different dreams. From an early age, Michael had shown exceptional intelligence and academic aptitude, traits he inherited from his mother, who worked as a high school math teacher. While James spent his days working construction sites and his nights with his brothers in the club, Michael excelled in school, earning straight A's and eventually receiving a full academic scholarship to UCLA. James was immensely proud, even though he didn't always understand his son's world of advanced calculus and computer science. Michael was in his junior year at UCLA, studying computer engineering with dreams of working in Silicon Valley, when he came home to San Bernardino for spring break in March 2022. He had plans to spend time with both his parents, catch up with old friends, and attend a club event with his father, something he still did occasionally to stay connected to that part of his roots. On March 12, 2022, Michael was driving home from having dinner with some high school friends at a restaurant in downtown San Bernardino. It was around 10:30 p.m., and the streets were relatively quiet. Michael was only 3 blocks from his mother's house when a stolen pickup truck ran a red light at the intersection of Baseline and Waterman Avenue, slamming into the driver's side of Michael's Honda Civic at over 70 miles per hour. The impact was catastrophic. Michael's car spun violently, crashed into a telephone pole, and was nearly split in half. The driver of the stolen truck, a 19-year-old gang member named Carlos Mendez who was high on methamphetamine and fleeing from police, stumbled out of his vehicle and tried to run, but was immediately apprehended by the officers who had been pursuing him. Michael was pronounced dead at the scene. He was 21 years old, 3 months away from his 22nd birthday. The news devastated James in ways he had never experienced before. He had lived a hard life, seen brothers die in motorcycle accidents, lost friends to violence and drugs, survived a near-fatal stabbing during a bar fight in his younger days, but nothing prepared him for the phone call from Rebecca at 11:45 p.m. that night, her voice barely coherent through the sobbing as she told him their son was gone. James had rushed to the hospital morgue, identifying Michael's body, seeing his son's peaceful face despite the trauma his body had endured, and something inside James broke that night. The funeral was held 5 days later, attended by hundreds of people, Michael's college friends, his high school teachers, his mother's family, and the entire San Bernardino chapter of the Hells Angels, who came in full colors, their motorcycles forming a honor guard procession that stretched for blocks. Michael was buried in Mountain View Cemetery, in a plot that James had personally selected, a peaceful spot under a large oak tree with a view of the San Bernardino Mountains in the distance. The headstone was simple but elegant, black granite with Michael's name, his dates of birth and death, and an inscription that James had chosen, "Beloved son, brilliant mind, forever in our hearts." In the weeks and months that followed, James fell into a deep depression. He stopped attending club meetings, stopped working, and spent most of his days drinking alone in his small apartment. His brothers tried to help, visiting regularly, bringing food, offering support, but James pushed them all away. It was his former wife, Rebecca, who finally got through to him 6 months after Michael's death. She came to his apartment, found him drunk and unshaven, and told him something that changed his perspective. "Michael would be ashamed to see you like this. He admired your strength, your loyalty, your ability to overcome anything. Honor his memory by living, not by destroying yourself." Those words struck James like a physical blow. He realized Rebecca was right. He owed it to Michael to keep living, to keep being the strong man his son had looked up to. James quit drinking that day, got back to work, and returned to the club, though he declined to resume his position as sergeant-at-arms, telling the president he needed to focus on his own healing. But there was one ritual he established and never missed. Every Saturday morning at 9 a.m., he would ride his Harley-Davidson to Mountain View Cemetery and spend an hour at Michael's grave. He would clean the headstone, leave fresh flowers, and talk to his son, telling him about his week, about club news, about how much he missed him. This routine had continued for 3 years without interruption. On this particular Saturday morning, James arrived at the cemetery right on schedule. The air was crisp and cold, and his breath formed small clouds as he walked through the iron gates, carrying a bouquet of white roses, Michael's mother's favorite flowers. James wore his usual Saturday morning attire, faded jeans, black boots, a black t-shirt under his leather Hells Angels vest with all his patches and pins, and a black bandana tied around his head. As he approached Michael's grave along the familiar winding path through the cemetery, he noticed something unusual. There were 2 figures at the grave next to Michael's, a grave that had been empty for the 3 years James had been visiting. As he got closer, he could see it was a woman and a small child, a little girl who looked to be about 4 or 5 years old. The woman was kneeling in front of a freshly installed headstone, her body shaking with sobs, while the little girl stood beside her, one small hand resting on her mother's shoulder, her own face streaked with tears. James slowed his pace, not wanting to intrude on their grief, understanding all too well the pain they were experiencing. As he reached Michael's grave, which was directly adjacent to theirs with only about 3 feet of grass separating them, he could hear the woman crying and speaking in Spanish, her words broken by sobs. James didn't speak Spanish fluently, but he had picked up enough over the years working construction sites in Southern California to understand some of what she was saying. She was apologizing, over and over, saying something about not being able to protect someone, about being sorry for failing. James tried to focus on his own ritual, kneeling down at Michael's grave, removing the flowers from last week, now wilted and brown, and arranging the fresh white roses in the built-in vase at the base of the headstone. But he couldn't help glancing over at the woman and child. The woman appeared to be in her early 30s, with long dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, wearing a simple black dress and a thin cardigan that seemed inadequate for the cold morning air. Her face, though contorted with grief, had delicate features that suggested she had been quite beautiful before sorrow had carved its lines. The little girl beside her had the same dark hair as her mother, falling in loose curls past her shoulders, and she wore a white dress with small flowers embroidered on it and a tiny black jacket. What struck James most was the expression on the child's face, not just sadness, but a deep, profound confusion, as if she couldn't comprehend why her mother was so upset or why they were in this place. James turned his attention back to Michael's grave, running his hand over the cold granite of the headstone, tracing his son's name with his fingers, a gesture he performed every week. "Hey, buddy," he said softly, his voice rough with emotion even after 3 years. "It's Dad again. Another Saturday. You know I never miss these. Weather's cold today, looks like it might rain. Remember how you used to hate the rain when you were little? You'd refuse to go outside without your yellow rain boots and that ridiculous frog umbrella your mom bought you. James smiled at the memory, but the smile was tinged with sadness. He continued talking, telling Michael about the week, about a new construction project he was working on, about club business, about how his mother was doing. As James spoke, he noticed the little girl next to him had stopped crying and was watching him with curious, wide brown eyes. Their eyes met for a moment, and James saw something in her expression that broke his heart, recognition of a kindred spirit, another person who understood loss. The child whispered something to her mother in Spanish, tugging gently on her arm, but the woman was too absorbed in her grief to respond, continuing to sob and speak to the grave before her. James looked at the new headstone and could now read the inscription, Diego Alejandro Ramirez, beloved husband and father, born May 3, 1988, died March 8, 2025. Tu familia te extraña cada dia. James did the mental math. Diego had been only 36 years old when he died, just 2 weeks ago according to the date. This was a fresh wound, raw and bleeding, unlike James's own grief which had been worn smooth by 3 years of Saturdays. The little girl suddenly spoke, her voice small but clear, and to James's surprise, she addressed him in English with only a slight accent. "Excuse me, mister. Is that your son?" She pointed at Michael's headstone. James looked down at her, taken aback by the directness of the question, but he nodded. "Yes, sweetheart. That's my boy, Michael. He's been here for 3 years now," James replied, his voice gentler than it had been in a long time. The little girl considered this information seriously, her small face thoughtful. "My papa is here now too," she said, pointing at the grave beside Michael's. "Mama says he's in heaven, but she keeps crying here. I don't understand why papa didn't take us with him if heaven is so nice." The innocent logic of a child's grief hit James hard, reminding him of conversations he'd had with Michael when the boy was young and James's own father had passed away. Before James could respond, the woman finally seemed to notice that her daughter was talking to someone. She looked up, her eyes red and swollen from crying, and when she saw James, this large, intimidating man covered in tattoos with his Hell's Angels vest, her face registered fear. She quickly stood up, pulling her daughter behind her protectively, and took a step back. Lo siento, she said rapidly, apologizing, her voice shaking. "Sofia, ven aquí, no molestes al señor." She was telling her daughter to come here, not to bother the man. James immediately recognized her fear and raised his hands in a peaceful gesture, trying to make himself appear less threatening, something he'd learned to do over the years when dealing with people who were intimidated by his appearance. "It's okay, ma'am. Your daughter wasn't bothering me at all," James said in his gentlest tone, which still came out gravelly and deep. I'm just visiting my son. He's right here, next to your—" He gestured at Diego's grave, "next to your husband, I'm guessing." The woman nodded hesitantly, still keeping Sofia partially behind her, her body language defensive. "Sí, mi esposo. My husband," she confirmed in broken English. Her accent was thick, and James could tell English was not her first language. She seemed to struggle to find the words she wanted to say. I sorry. We not mean to disturb. Sofia, she talked to everyone. I tell her not to." Her voice was barely above a whisper, and she kept glancing at James's vest, at the death head patch, clearly recognizing what it meant. James shook his head. "You're not disturbing anyone, ma'am. This is a cemetery. We're all here for the same reason." "Well, versions of the same reason," he added, looking at Michael's grave. There was a long moment of awkward silence, filled only by the sound of wind rustling through the oak trees and the distant caw of crows. James could see the woman was shivering, whether from cold or from residual sobbing or fear, he wasn't sure, probably a combination of all three. Little Sofia peeked out from behind her mother, still looking at James with those curious eyes. "Are you a good guy or a bad guy?" she asked suddenly, her child's directness cutting through the tension. "Sofia," her mother hissed, mortified, but James actually chuckled, a sound that surprised even himself. "I think that depends on who you ask, little one," James replied honestly. but I'd like to think I'm one of the good ones. Your papa, was he a good guy? Sophia's face lit up at the mention of her father. Papa was the best. He would carry me on his shoulders and make funny voices for all my stuffed animals, and he made the best breakfast pancakes with chocolate chips, and he always knew how to make Mama laugh when she was sad. The words tumbled out of her in a rush until her mother gently placed a hand on her shoulder, stopping the flow. The woman's eyes filled with fresh tears at her daughter's description. He was. Diego was very good man, she managed to say in English. He worked very hard. He tried to give us good life. James nodded, understanding perfectly. My son was a good kid too. Smart. Really smart. He was going to change the world, or at least make some good money trying, James said with a sad smile. 3 years he's been here, and I still come every Saturday. Can't seem to break the habit. Don't think I want to. The woman looked at him with new eyes, some of the fear fading, replaced by a recognition of shared pain. 3 years? And you still come? James nodded. Every Saturday, 9 a.m., rain or shine. It's the only appointment I never miss. The woman seemed to process this information, and something in her posture relaxed slightly. I don't know how to do this, she said, her voice breaking. How to live without him. How to raise Sophia alone. How to. She trailed off, unable to continue, tears streaming down her face again. James looked at this broken woman and her innocent child, and something stirred in his chest, something he hadn't felt in a long time, the urge to help, to protect, to use his strength for someone other than himself. You do it one day at a time, ma'am. 1 hour at a time if you have to. Some days, 1 minute at a time, James said, his voice carrying the weight of experience. It doesn't get easier, not really. But you get stronger. You learn to carry it. And you do it for them, he gestured to Sophia, because they need you to. The woman looked at him, really looked at him for the first time, seeing past the intimidating exterior to the grieving father underneath. Thank you, she whispered. I am Mariana. Mariana Ramirez. This is Sophia. James Sullivan. Everyone calls me Hammer, he replied, then paused. Look, I don't mean to intrude or anything, but it's getting cold out here, and you both look like you could use. I don't know, a warm drink or something? There's a diner about 2 blocks from here. They make decent coffee and hot chocolate. My treat, if you want. He surprised himself with the offer, but it felt right somehow. Mariana hesitated, uncertainty crossing her face, and James quickly added, no strings attached. Just, it's hard, doing this alone. I get it. Sometimes it helps to talk to someone who understands. But if you'd rather not, that's okay too. I understand. Sophia tugged on her mother's hand. I'm cold, Mama. And hungry. Can we go with the nice man? Mariana looked down at her daughter, then back at James, clearly torn between caution and the genuine kindness she saw in his offer. Finally, she nodded slowly. Okay. Yes. Thank you, Mr. Hammer. That is very kind. James smiled, a real smile this time, something that felt foreign on his face. Just Hammer is fine. Come on, let's get you two warmed up. As they walked toward the cemetery gates, James glanced back at the 2 graves, side by side, Michael's weathered headstone and Diego's freshly installed one. 2 fathers, 2 families destroyed by tragedy, now connected by the random geography of death. James had no idea that this chance meeting would change all of their lives in ways none of them could have imagined. Chapter 2, The Stories We Carry. The Silver Spoon Diner was a local institution in San Bernardino, a classic American establishment that had been serving the community since 1965. Its chrome exterior and red vinyl booths gave it a nostalgic charm, and the smell of coffee and bacon that perpetually filled the air was comforting in a way that transcended simple hunger. James held the door open for Mariana and Sophia, noting how Mariana still moved hesitantly, her hand protectively gripping Sophia's shoulder as they entered. The Saturday morning crowd was moderate, a few elderly couples, some construction workers grabbing breakfast before their shifts, a family with young children making a mess of pancakes and syrup. The hostess, a woman in her 50s named Betty who had worked at the Silver Spoon for as long as James could remember, greeted him with familiarity. "Morning, Hammer." "Your usual spot?" she asked, grabbing 3 menus. Betty had served James countless times over the years, had served him and Michael together on those special Saturday mornings when the boy was younger and they'd come here after cemetery visits. She'd been at Michael's funeral. She knew the significance of James being here with a woman and child who weren't his family, but she was professional enough not to comment, simply leading them to a booth in the back corner, James's preferred spot where he could sit with his back to the wall and see the entire restaurant, an old habit from his years in the club. They slid into the booth, Sophia bouncing slightly on the vinyl seat with the resilience of children who can find momentary joy even in the darkest circumstances. Mariana sat stiffly, her hands clasped in her lap, her eyes red-rimmed and exhausted. James took the seat across from them, his large frame making the booth seem smaller. Betty brought over a pot of coffee and a pitcher of water, setting down 3 empty cups. "Can I get the little lady some hot chocolate?" she asked Sophia with a warm smile. Sophia looked to her mother for permission, and Mariana nodded. "Yes, please. With the cream on top?" Sophia asked hopefully. "Extra whipped cream, coming right up," Betty confirmed with a wink before walking away. James poured coffee for himself and offered the pot to Mariana, who accepted with a quiet "gracias." They sat in silence for a moment, the awkwardness of the situation settling over them like a heavy blanket. James wasn't typically good at small talk, especially with strangers, but something about Mariana's obvious pain and Sophia's innocent presence made him want to try. So, he began carefully, wrapping his large hands around the coffee cup. "You said Diego was your husband. How long were you married?" Mariana looked up from her untouched coffee, her eyes distant as she accessed memories that were clearly painful. 8 years. We marry in Mexico, in my hometown of Guadalajara, then we come here to United States for better life, she explained in halting English. Diego, he have big dreams. He wants Sophia to have opportunities we never have. He work 3 jobs sometimes. James nodded, understanding the immigrant struggle, having worked alongside many Mexican and Central American workers throughout his construction career. 3 jobs is rough. What did he do? Mariana's face softened slightly as she talked about Diego, the grief momentarily giving way to love and pride. In day, he worked construction, like making buildings. And at night, he clean offices in big towers downtown. And weekends, he do landscaping, cutting grass, planting flowers for rich people houses, she said. Her English was improving as she spoke, as if the act of talking about her husband helped her access the language better. He almost never sleep. Always working. I tell him, Diego, you need rest, you need be with family, but he say, Mariana, I rest when Sophia go to college, when we have house, when we have security. Tears began sliding down her cheeks again. But he never get to rest. He never get to see those things. What happened to him? James asked gently, though he wasn't sure if he should. Mariana wiped her eyes with a paper napkin, taking a shaky breath before responding. Accident. At construction site. Diego was working on big project, new apartment building downtown. Something with the scaffold. It collapse. Diego and 2 other men fall. The other men, they survive with broken bones. But Diego, he fall different way, he hit his head. Her voice broke, and she had to pause to compose herself. Sophia, who had been coloring on the paper placemat with crayons Betty had brought, looked up at her mother with worried eyes. It's okay, Mama. Papa doesn't hurt anymore. Remember, you said he's with the angels. Mariana pulled her daughter close, kissing the top of her head, her body shaking with suppressed sobs. James felt a familiar rage building in his chest, the same rage he'd felt when Michael died, anger at the unfairness of life, at the randomness of tragedy, at the way good people suffered while others seemed to skate through life unscathed. Was the construction company, were they following safety protocols? Was the equipment maintained properly? He asked, his voice taking on a harder edge. He knew the construction industry inside and out, knew how corners were cut, how workers, especially immigrant workers, were often put in dangerous situations without proper safety measures. Mariana looked confused by the question, clearly not understanding terms like protocols. I don't know. The company, they say it was accident, nobody fault. They give me some money, pay for funeral, but not much. They say Diego was contract worker, not full employee, so they not responsible for much. James's jaw clenched. He knew exactly what that meant. Diego had probably been hired as an independent contractor, a common tactic companies used to avoid providing benefits, insurance, or taking responsibility when things went wrong. Did you talk to a lawyer? He asked. Mariana shook her head, looking overwhelmed. I don't know lawyers. I don't know how American system work. And we not have papers. Diego and me, we come here on tourist visa long time ago, but we stay after it expire because we couldn't go back, there was nothing for us in Mexico. Diego was trying to fix papers, working with someone who say they could help, but it take long time and much money. Now I am afraid if I make trouble, if I ask questions, they will send me and Sofia back to Mexico, or worse, they take Sofia from me. The fear in her voice was palpable, the fear of a woman alone in a country where she existed in the shadows, vulnerable and powerless. James had never paid much attention to immigration issues before. It wasn't something that directly affected him or his world. But sitting across from Mariana and Sofia, seeing their pain and fear, understanding how Diego had worked himself to death trying to provide for them only to leave them in an even more precarious situation, something shifted in James's perspective. That's bullshit, he said bluntly, then quickly added, sorry for the language, with a glance at Sofia, who seemed more interested in her hot chocolate, which had just arrived with a mountain of whipped cream as promised. You and Sofia shouldn't have to live in fear. Diego died working an honest job. That company should be held accountable. Mariana gave him a sad, tired smile. You are kind to say this, Hammer. But this is reality for people like us. We have no power here. We are, how you say, invisible until someone want to get rid of us. She said it matter-of-factly, without bitterness, as if stating an immutable law of nature. James realized she was probably right, but it still galled him. He was about to respond when Betty returned to take their food orders. James ordered his usual, eggs, bacon, hash browns, toast, while Mariana ordered the cheapest thing on the menu, a bowl of oatmeal, despite James insisting she could order anything she wanted. Sofia asked for pancakes with chocolate chips, and James told Betty to add a side of fruit and bacon to that order, earning a grateful look from Mariana. After Betty left, James decided to redirect the conversation, sensing that Mariana needed a break from talking about Diego's death. Sofia, that's a pretty name. Does it mean something special? He asked the little girl, who had whipped cream on her nose. Sofia nodded enthusiastically. Mama says it means wisdom. Papa said I was going to be the smartest girl in the whole world, smarter even than the Presidente, she announced proudly. James chuckled. Well, you're already pretty smart, asking good questions like you did at the cemetery. Are you in school? Sofia nodded again. I'm in kindergarten. I can read and write and count to 100 in English and Spanish. She was clearly proud of this accomplishment. That's impressive. My son Michael, he was really smart too. He could speak some Spanish, Japanese, and he was learning Mandarin Chinese in college. He said knowing languages would help him in his career, James said, the words coming easier than they usually did when he talked about Michael. What was his career? Mariana asked, engaging more in the conversation now that the focus had shifted. He was studying computer engineering at UCLA. He wanted to design software or work on artificial intelligence or something like that. I didn't always understand what he was talking about when he explained it, but I knew it was important work, James said with a mixture of pride and sorrow. He was only 21 when he died. Drunk driver ran a red light, hit him head-on. Kid was high on meth, stole the truck he was driving. Michael died instantly. Mariana's hand flew to her mouth. Dios mío. I am so sorry. That is terrible. So young, with so much life ahead. James nodded, staring into his coffee cup. Yeah. The worst part was that the kid who hit him, he got off easy. His lawyer argued diminished capacity due to drug use, some technicality about the evidence collection, and he ended up with only 7 years in prison. He'll be out in less than 5 with good behavior. 5 years for taking my son's life. For destroying my family. The bitterness in James's voice was unmistakable, 3 years of suppressed rage surfacing. I wanted to kill him. Seriously considered it. Knew I could get to him, knew I could make it look like a prison yard accident. I have connections, ways to make things happen. But Michael's mother, Rebecca, she begged me not to. Said it wouldn't bring Michael back, would only destroy what was left of our family if I ended up in prison for the rest of my life. She was right, but it still eats at me. Mariana reached across the table, hesitantly placing her hand on James's forearm, a gesture of comfort and solidarity. The anger, it is hard to carry, yes. I feel it too. Angry at the construction company, at the men who didn't check the scaffold, at Diego for working so hard he was probably too tired to be careful, at God for allowing this to happen. Her eyes met James's, and in that moment, they shared an understanding that went beyond words, the understanding of two people who had lost everything. But we must find a way to live with it, for them. She glanced at Sophia, who was now engaged in making a smiley face in her whipped cream with her finger. They would want us to live, to be happy again someday, no? James looked at Sophia's innocent joy, her ability to find a moment of happiness even in the midst of her family's tragedy, and felt something shift in his chest. Yeah, they would, he agreed quietly. Their food arrived, and they ate mostly in companionable silence, occasionally making small talk about neutral topics, the weather, Sophia's favorite subjects in school, James's motorcycle which Sophia was fascinated by. As they finished eating, James found himself reluctant for the morning to end. There was something healing about being with Mariana and Sophia, about sharing his grief with someone who truly understood, about having someone to protect and help even in this small way. When Betty brought the check, James grabbed it before Mariana could even reach for it. I said it was my treat, he reminded her. As they prepared to leave, James pulled out his wallet and handed Mariana a business card with his phone number on it. Look, I know we just met, and this might seem forward, but, if you need anything, okay? If you have questions about dealing with the construction company, or if you need help figuring out the legal stuff, or even if you just need someone to talk to who gets it, call me. Anytime, he said. Mariana took the card, looking at it and then at James with eyes that were still sad but also held a glimmer of hope. Thank you, Hammer. You are a good man. I can see why your son loved you, she said softly. Those words hit James harder than any punch he'd ever taken. He blinked back sudden moisture in his eyes and simply nodded, not trusting his voice. They walked out of the diner together into the cold morning air. James pointed out his Harley in the parking lot, and Sophia's eyes went wide with excitement. Can I sit on it? Please, 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 she begged her mother. Mariana looked uncertain, but James smiled. It's okay. The engine's off. She can sit on it for a minute if you want, he offered. He lifted Sophia up onto the seat, and her face lit up with pure joy as she gripped the handlebars, making motorcycle noises. Vroom, vroom. Look, Mama, I'm a motorcycle driver, she giggled. Mariana laughed, actually laughed, the first time James had heard the sound, and it was beautiful. After a few minutes, James lifted Sophia down, and Mariana told him they needed to get back home. They had taken the bus to the cemetery and needed to catch the next one. Where do you live? James asked. Not far, maybe 2 miles from here, near Highland Avenue, Mariana replied. James shook his head. That's too far to walk in this cold, and the bus schedule on Saturdays is terrible. Let me give you a ride. I can come back for my bike later, or, actually, wait here a second. He jogged back into the diner and asked Betty if he could leave his motorcycle in their lot for a couple of hours, promising to move it before the lunch rush. Betty agreed without hesitation. James returned to find Mariana looking uncomfortable. You don't have to do this. We don't want to be burden, she protested. You're not a burden. I'm offering because I want to, James insisted. Besides, I need to walk off that breakfast anyway. Come on, it's too cold for Sophia to be waiting for buses. Reluctantly, Mariana agreed, and they began walking toward Highland Avenue, Sophia chattering happily between them, holding both her mother's hand and, to James's surprise and secret delight, his hand as well. As they walked through the streets of San Bernardino, James learned more about Mariana's situation. She and Sophia lived in a tiny studio apartment in a rundown complex. Since Diego's death, Mariana had been trying to figure out how to support herself and her daughter. She had worked as a housekeeper before Sophia was born but had stayed home with her daughter since then, as childcare was too expensive and Diego had wanted her to be there for Sophia. Now she was desperately looking for work, any work, but without papers, her options were limited. Diego's brother, he live in Riverside, he say we can come stay with him and his family, but... Mariana trailed off, her expression troubled. But what? James prompted. His wife, she not like me very much. And their house is very small, already too many people. I don't want to be, how you say, charity case. I want to take care of Sophia myself, make our own way. But is hard. Is very hard, she admitted. James could hear the desperation beneath her words, the pride fighting against practical necessity. When they reached Mariana's apartment building, James's heart sank. The building was clearly in poor condition, with peeling paint, cracked windows, and the smell of mildew and garbage permeating the air. This was no place for a woman and child to live alone, especially in this neighborhood which James knew from his construction work had high crime rates. Mariana saw his expression and said defensively, "Is not so bad. Is what we can afford. Inside is clean, I make sure of that." James didn't argue, just nodded. "I'm sure it is," he said diplomatically. "Well, I should let you get settled. But remember what I said, if you need anything, call me." He crouched down to Sophia's level. "It was nice meeting you, Sophia. You take care of your mama, okay?" Sophia threw her arms around his neck in an impromptu hug that caught James completely off guard. "Thank you for the pancakes and for letting me sit on your motorcycle. You're my favorite big scary man." James couldn't help but laugh, a real genuine laugh that felt like medicine for his soul. As he walked back to the diner to retrieve his motorcycle, James couldn't stop thinking about Mariana and Sophia. Their situation was precarious at best, dangerous at worst. He thought about Diego, working himself to death trying to provide for his family, only to leave them in an even worse position. He thought about the construction company that had likely cut corners on safety to save money, resulting in Diego's death, and then paid Mariana off with the bare minimum to avoid further liability. The injustice of it burned in his gut. When James got home to his own apartment that afternoon, he did something he hadn't done in months, he called a club meeting. That evening, 15 members of the San Bernardino chapter of the Hells Angels gathered at their clubhouse, a nondescript building on the outskirts of town that served as their headquarters. The clubhouse was decorated with motorcycling memorabilia, photographs of fallen brothers, and the ever-present death head insignia. James stood before his brothers, men he had ridden with for decades, men who had stood by him through Michael's death and his subsequent breakdown, and told them about Mariana and Sophia. He told them about Diego's death, about the construction company's negligence, about the widow and child left alone and vulnerable. "I know this isn't typically our kind of thing," James said, addressing the group. "But these people need help. Real help. And I think we might be in a position to give it to them." The room was silent for a moment before Marcus Wrench Coleman, the chapter president and James's friend of over 20 years, spoke up. "What exactly are you proposing, Hammer?" James had been thinking about this all afternoon. "First, I want to look into this construction company, find out if they were following proper safety protocols. If they weren't, I want to help Mariana pursue legal action. Second, I want to make sure she and her daughter have a safe place to live and food to eat while she gets back on her feet. And third, I don't know, man. I just know I can't walk away from this." Wrench exchanged glances with several other members, a silent communication that James recognized from years of brotherhood. "Brothers," Wrench addressed the group, "Hammer has never asked us for much, even when he was going through his darkest times after losing Michael. If he's saying these people need our help, then I believe him. All in favor of supporting Hammer in this endeavor, say aye." A chorus of ayes filled the room, unanimous support from his brothers. James felt his throat tighten with emotion. This was why he loved the club, why he had dedicated his life to it, this sense of brotherhood, of having people who would back you up no matter what. "Thank you, brothers. This means everything," James said, his voice rough. What neither James nor Mariana knew yet was that this decision, this choice to help a stranger in need, would set in motion a series of events that would test them both, bring them together in ways neither expected, and ultimately give them both a second chance at life and love they thought they'd lost forever. Chapter 3: The Road to Redemption. The weeks following that fateful Saturday at the cemetery brought changes to both James's and Mariana's lives that neither could have anticipated. True to their word, the Hells Angels San Bernardino chapter mobilized with the efficiency and determination that had made them legendary in the motorcycle community. James, with the help of his brother Wrench who had connections throughout the construction industry, began investigating the circumstances of Diego Ramirez's death. What they uncovered made James's blood boil. The construction company, Riverside Development and Construction, was owned by a man named Martin Prescott, a wealthy developer with a reputation for cutting corners and exploiting undocumented workers who were too afraid to report safety violations or demand proper compensation. The scaffold that had collapsed, killing Diego, had been cited for safety violations on 3 previous occasions by independent inspectors, but Prescott had paid fines and continued using the faulty equipment rather than investing in replacements. Moreover, the company had a history of classifying workers as independent contractors specifically to avoid liability, workers' compensation requirements, and providing proper safety training. Diego had been working on the site for only 2 weeks before his death, brought in through a labor broker who specialized in finding undocumented workers willing to take dangerous jobs for less than minimum wage. James compiled all this information and brought it to Rebecca, Michael's mother, who had a close friend who practiced personal injury law. The attorney, a sharp woman named Linda Patterson, agreed to meet with Mariana pro bono after hearing the circumstances. James arranged the meeting, picking up Mariana and Sophia from their apartment on a Wednesday afternoon and driving them to Linda's downtown office in his pickup truck, having decided his Harley wasn't appropriate transportation for a woman and child. Mariana was terrified at first, convinced that involving lawyers would somehow result in her and Sophia being deported, but James and Linda both assured her that California had protections for workers regardless of immigration status, and that pursuing a wrongful death claim wouldn't automatically trigger immigration enforcement. Linda was outraged by what she learned about Riverside Development and Construction's practices. She took Mariana's case immediately, agreeing to work on contingency, meaning Mariana wouldn't have to pay unless they won a settlement or judgment. "Mrs. Ramirez, your husband's death was not an accident," Linda told Mariana firmly, her voice full of conviction. "It was the direct result of negligence and willful disregard for worker safety. Martin Prescott and his company need to be held accountable, not just for Diego, but for all the other workers they've endangered. With your permission, I'm going to go after them hard." Mariana, with tears streaming down her face, nodded and signed the retainer agreement. For the first time since Diego's death, she felt a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, his life and death would mean something, that justice might be possible. While the legal case began to take shape, James and the Hells Angels addressed the more immediate problem of Mariana and Sophia's living situation. The studio apartment they were renting was not only in poor condition but also in a dangerous neighborhood. James had learned from Mariana that she had been struggling to pay the rent, $8.50 a month, which seemed absurdly high for such a terrible place, but was typical for low-income housing in the area. One of the club members, Tommy Gears Martinez, owned a small 2-bedroom house in a much better neighborhood that he had been renting out. The previous tenants had just moved out, and Tommy offered to rent it to Mariana at a significantly reduced rate, $600 a month, utilities included, until she got on her feet. When James told Mariana about the house, she was overwhelmed. "I cannot accept this. It's too much. You have already done so much for me and Sophia," she protested, though James could see the longing in her eyes at the prospect of a safe home for her daughter. "Mariana, Tommy wants to help. We all want to help. Let us do this," James insisted gently. "Besides, the place has been empty for 2 weeks. He'd rather have good tenants like you at a reduced rate than have it sit empty. You'd actually be doing him a favor." It was a bit of a stretch of the truth. Tommy would have had no trouble finding tenants at market rate, but James knew Mariana's pride wouldn't allow her to accept what she perceived as charity. Finally, Mariana agreed, and the following Saturday, the entire Hells Angels chapter showed up at her studio apartment with trucks and motorcycles to help her move. It was quite a sight, 15 burly bikers in their leather vests and colors, carrying boxes and furniture, carefully packing Sophia's toys and clothes, loading everything into pickup trucks. The neighbors watched with wide eyes, some fearful, others curious. Mariana was embarrassed at first by how little she owned. Most of their belongings fit into 3 truckloads, but the men were respectful and kind, treating her few possessions with care. Sophia was absolutely delighted by all the attention, riding on various bikers' shoulders and helping by carrying small items like books and stuffed animals. By the end of the day, Mariana and Sophia were settled into their new home, a clean, well-maintained house with a small yard, functioning appliances, and even a bedroom for Sophia decorated with fresh paint and new curtains that some of the members' wives had contributed. As the weeks turned into months, James found himself spending more and more time with Mariana and Sophia. What had started as helping a stranger in need had evolved into something deeper. He helped Mariana find work cleaning houses for families in better neighborhoods, using his connections and personal recommendations to vouch for her reliability and work ethic. He taught her basic English phrases that would help her communicate better with clients. He helped Sophia with her homework on evenings when Mariana was working late. He fixed things around their house, a leaky faucet, a broken step, a door that wouldn't close properly, and refused to accept payment, though Mariana always tried to feed him in return, insisting he stay for dinner. Those dinners became the highlight of James's week. Mariana was an excellent cook, preparing traditional Mexican dishes that filled the house with incredible aromas: chili verde, pozole, enchiladas verdes, homemade tortillas that were nothing like the store-bought ones James was used to. They would sit around the small kitchen table, Sophia chattering about her day at school, Mariana occasionally correcting her daughter's table manners in Spanish, and James contributing stories from his construction work or club activities that were appropriate for a 5-year-old's ears. There was a domesticity to these evenings that James hadn't experienced since Michael was young, a warmth and sense of family that he'd forgotten he was missing. He also noticed changes in Mariana. The crushing grief that had defined her that first day at the cemetery was still there. He could see it in her eyes when she looked at Diego's photo, which she kept on a small altar in the living room with candles and flowers, but she was learning to carry it, just as James had learned to carry his own grief for Michael. She smiled more often, laughed at James's awkward attempts at Spanish, and slowly began to rebuild her life. She was fiercely independent and proud, working hard to pay her reduced rent on time every month and gradually saving money for the first time in years. James admired her strength, her determination to create a good life for Sophia despite the obstacles she faced. For her part, Mariana found herself drawn to James in ways that both confused and frightened her. On the surface, he was everything she should be afraid of: a large, intimidating man covered in tattoos, a member of a notorious motorcycle club with a fearsome reputation. But underneath that exterior, she discovered a man of tremendous kindness, loyalty, and integrity. He was gentle with Sophia, patient with Mariana's limited English, generous without being condescending, strong without being domineering. He spoke about Michael with a love and pride that moved her to tears, and she could see in his eyes the same pain she carried for Diego. They were 2 wounded souls who had found each other by chance, or perhaps by fate, in a cemetery where their loved ones rested side by side. 6 months after that first meeting, Linda Patterson called with news: Riverside Development and Construction had agreed to a settlement. Rather than face a trial where their pattern of negligence and exploitation would be exposed publicly, Martin Prescott's company had offered Mariana a settlement of $750,000. After legal fees and expenses, Mariana would receive approximately $500,000, more money than she had ever imagined having in her entire life. When James drove her to Linda's office to sign the settlement papers, Mariana was shaking. "This is because of you," she told James as they sat in the parking lot before going in. "All of this. You gave me courage to fight, you helped me find Linda, you and your brothers gave me safe place to live and time to heal. I don't know how to thank you." James shook his head. "You don't need to thank me, Mariana. You did this. You were brave enough to pursue justice for Diego. You're the one raising Sofia and rebuilding your life. I just helped a little." Mariana reached over and took his hand, the first time she had initiated physical contact with him beyond polite handshakes. "You helped more than a little, James. You saved us. You gave us hope when we had none. You—" She paused, searching for the English words she needed. "You showed us there are still good people in this world, people who help strangers for no reason except it is right thing to do." Her hand was small and warm in his, and James felt something shift in his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years, not since before Michael's death, perhaps not since his divorce from Rebecca, the tentative beginning of romantic love. With the settlement money, Mariana's life transformed. She opened a savings account for Sofia's future education, putting aside $200,000 that she vowed not to touch until her daughter was ready for college. She bought a reliable used car, a Honda Odyssey, so she could drive to her cleaning jobs without relying on unreliable public transportation. She began taking English classes at the community college, determined to improve her language skills and eventually earn her GED. And she continued renting Tommy's house, though she insisted on paying full market rate now that she could afford it, putting the extra money Tommy had been discounting toward a fund he established for helping other families in need. But the most significant change was in her relationship with James. 8 months after they met, James finally worked up the courage to ask Mariana out on a proper date, not just their comfortable dinners at her house, but an evening out, just the two of them. He was nervous as a teenager, stuttering through the invitation, terrified she would say no, would tell him she only saw him as a friend, would remind him that it was too soon after Diego's death. But Mariana said yes, her face lighting up with a shy smile that made James's heart skip a beat. They went to a Mexican restaurant that Mariana had heard about but never been able to afford, and over enchiladas and margaritas, they talked for hours, about their childhoods, their dreams, their losses, their fears, their hopes for the future. "I never thought I could feel this way again," Mariana confessed as they shared flan for dessert. "After Diego died, I thought that part of my heart was dead too, that I would never want to be with another man. I felt guilty even thinking about it, like I was betraying his memory." James understood perfectly. "I felt the same way after my divorce from Rebecca, and even more so after Michael died. I thought I was done with relationships, with letting people get close. It hurt too much to lose them. But then I met you and Sofia, and something changed. I started feeling alive again." Mariana reached across the table and took his hand again, a gesture that was becoming familiar and comforting. "Do you think they would approve? Diego and Michael? Do you think they would want this for us?" James thought about Michael, about the conversations they'd had about life and happiness and not letting fear prevent you from living fully. "I think Michael would be happy that I found someone who makes me smile again. And from what you've told me about Diego, I think he'd want you and Sofia to be happy, to be loved and protected. He worked so hard trying to give you a good life. I think he'd be grateful that someone is here to help make sure you have that." Tears welled up in Mariana's eyes, but they were good tears this time, tears of relief and hope. "Then maybe this is okay. Maybe we are allowed to be happy again." James squeezed her hand. "Maybe we are." Their relationship developed slowly, carefully, two people who had loved and lost learning to trust and love again. James was patient, never pushing Mariana faster than she was comfortable moving. He understood her need to honor Diego's memory, her concerns about how a new relationship might affect Sofia, her fear of being hurt again. For her part, Mariana appreciated James's gentleness, his respect for her boundaries, his genuine love for her daughter. Sofia adored James, calling him Tio James at first, and eventually, with Mariana's permission, simply James, understanding that he was becoming something more than an uncle figure in their lives. A year after they met, on a Saturday morning in March, James took Mariana and Sofia to Mountain View Cemetery, as he did every week now, visiting both Michael's and Diego's graves together as a family. They brought fresh flowers for both men, and while Sofia played nearby, James and Mariana stood between the two headstones, holding hands. "I've been thinking," James said quietly, his voice rough with emotion, "about how strange life is, how tragedy can somehow lead to unexpected blessings. If Michael hadn't died, I wouldn't have been at this cemetery that day. If Diego hadn't died, you wouldn't have been here either. We found each other in our grief, and somehow, that grief transformed into something beautiful." Mariana nodded, leaning her head against his shoulder. "In Spanish, we have a saying, no hay mal que por bien no venga. It means, there is no bad from which good does not come. I think about this often. Diego's death was terrible, the worst thing that ever happened to me. But it brought me to you, and through you, to safety and support and love for me and Sofia. I feel guilty saying this, but I am grateful for what came from that tragedy, even as I still mourn what was lost." James understood completely. He still grieved Michael every day, still talked to his son's gravestone every Saturday, still felt the ache of his absence. But he had also found new purpose, new family, new love. Life was complex that way, able to hold both sorrow and joy simultaneously. 2 years after their first meeting, James proposed to Mariana in the small house that had become their shared home. He had moved in 6 months earlier, after a long conversation with Mariana about their future and whether they were ready to fully commit to building a life together. It felt right, the three of them together, and even Tommy had been happy to have his property occupied by people he now considered family. James proposed with a simple but beautiful ring, surrounded by his Hells Angels brothers and their families, all of whom had grown to love Mariana and Sofia as part of their extended club family. Mariana said yes through tears of joy, and Sofia jumped up and down screaming with excitement, already calling James Papa James in her mind, though she still honored her father Diego's memory with love and respect. They were married 6 months later in a small ceremony at the same cemetery where they had met, with Michael's and Diego's graves decorated with flowers and serving as silent witnesses to the union. It was unconventional, perhaps even morbid to some, but to James and Mariana, it felt perfect, honoring the men they had lost while celebrating the love they had found. Rebecca attended the wedding, having become friends with Mariana over the years, and told James afterward, Michael would have loved her. And he would have been so proud of you for opening your heart again. The Hells Angels San Bernardino chapter attended in full colors, their motorcycles forming an honor guard, and Sofia served as the flower girl, wearing a white dress with a small leather vest that matched James's, a gift from the club. Aftermath. What came next? In the years that followed, James and Mariana built a life that honored both their past losses and their present love. They eventually bought their own home, a modest 3-bedroom house with a yard large enough for Sofia to play in and for James to work on his motorcycles. Mariana completed her GED and started her own house cleaning business, eventually employing 5 other women, many of them immigrants like herself whom she paid fair wages and treated with dignity. James continued his construction work and his involvement with the Hells Angels, though he took on a less active role in club activities to spend more time with his family. Sofia thrived, growing into a bright, confident young woman who spoke fluent English and Spanish, excelled in school, and dreamed of becoming a lawyer like Linda Patterson, the woman who had helped her mother get justice for her father. She never forgot Diego, keeping his photo by her bedside and visiting his grave every Saturday with James and Mariana, but she also fully embraced James as her second father, the man who had stepped in to protect and provide for her and her mother when they needed it most. The bond between James and Sofia was deep and genuine, built on years of homework help, motorcycle rides, construction projects worked on together, and countless conversations about life, loss, and love. The Hells Angels San Bernardino chapter, inspired by James's actions, established a charitable foundation to help families of workers killed or injured in workplace accidents, particularly those involving immigrant workers who might not know their rights or have access to legal resources. They called it the Diego Ramirez Memorial Fund, with Mariana serving on the board and helping to direct resources to families in need. Over the years, the fund helped dozens of families, providing financial assistance, legal referrals, and support networks to people navigating the aftermath of workplace tragedies. It became one of the club's proudest achievements, a tangible way to channel their brotherhood and resources toward meaningful community impact. James and Mariana also started a tradition of spending holidays at Mountain View Cemetery, bringing picnic lunches and spending time at both Michael's and Diego's graves, telling stories about the men they had lost to keep their memories alive. They invited Rebecca to join them, and she often did, forming an unlikely but loving extended family bound together by shared loss and mutual respect. These cemetery picnics became sacred times, opportunities to remember, to grieve, and to celebrate the complex journey that had brought them all together. As Sophia prepared to graduate high school with honors and a full scholarship to USC, where she would study pre-law, James reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. That chance encounter at the cemetery, when a grieving Hell's Angel and a desperate Spanish widow had found each other at their respective breaking points, had transformed all of their lives. Michael's death had nearly destroyed James, and Diego's death had left Mariana and Sophia vulnerable and alone. But somehow, through pain and loss, they had found each other and built something beautiful, a family forged not by blood, but by choice, compassion, and love. James often thought about that Saturday morning, about how he had almost not offered to buy Mariana and Sophia coffee, about how easily he could have just minded his own business and walked away. But something, fate, divine intervention, Michael's spirit, he wasn't sure what, had compelled him to reach out, to help, to care. And that choice had saved him as much as it had saved Mariana and Sophia. They had rescued each other, really, pulling each other out of darkness and into light, proving that even in our deepest grief, we are capable of loving again, of building again, of finding purpose and joy again. On the anniversary of their wedding each year, James and Mariana would return to Mountain View Cemetery at dawn, standing between Michael's and Diego's graves as the sun rose over the San Bernardino Mountains. They would thank the men they had lost for the lives they had lived, for the lessons they had taught, and for somehow, in ways they might never fully understand, bringing their families together. And then they would go home to Sophia, to the life they had built together, to the proof that love endures, that hope survives, and that from our greatest losses can come our greatest blessings.